The cabin sat low against the ridge, half buried in snow that had been falling for 3 days without pause. And Celia hadn't eaten anything warm since the night before she lost the trail and stumbled onto this forgotten place. She was 16, alone, and the kind of lost that meant no one was coming, not because they didn't care, but because there was no one left to care. The dog appeared on the second morning, gaunt and shivering, scratching at the door with paws wrapped in ice, and when she opened it, he limped inside and collapsed by the wood stove without a sound. She didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers, but they understood each other in the way that the desperate do. And she gave him half of the stale bread she'd found in the cabin's cupboard and decided that if she was going to survive this, she wouldn't do it alone. Outside, the wind shrieked through the pines and the snow piled higher against the windows. And somewhere beyond the clearing, barely visible through the white, stood a barn she hadn't yet dared to enter. Celia had been on the mountain for 5 days when she found the cabin. Before that, there had been the group home in the valley, the fight with the older girls, the decision to run that felt like courage at the time and like stupidity now. She'd planned to reach the logging road on the far side of the ridge and hitch a ride to the coast, to disappear into a city where no one knew her name, or the fact that both her parents were dead and the state had stopped trying to place her anywhere permanent. But the storm came early, vicious and unseasonable, and the trail vanished under a foot of powder before she'd made it halfway. She'd walked until her boots were soaked through and her fingers wouldn't bend, until the light started to fail and panic began to taste like metal in her mouth. The cabin appeared just as the sky turned bruise blue. A small dark shape hunched between the trees, and she'd shouldered the door open and stumbled into a space that smelled like dust and old smoke and the faint sweetness of rot. There wasn't much inside. A single room with a loft ladder, a black iron stove squatting in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with a bare mattress striped in mildew, firewood stacked against the wall, bone dry and flecked with bark. She got a fire, going with the matches she'd stolen from the group home kitchen, and the stove ticked and groaned as it warmed, and for the first time in 2 days, she stopped shaking. She ate a granola bar from her backpack, melted snow in a dented pot for water, and slept curled on the mattress under every piece of clothing she owned. When she woke, the storm was still howling, and the world beyond the window was nothing but white. The dog changed everything. He was a shepherd mix, brown and black with one ear torn, and a gash healing badly along his ribs, and he looked at her with eyes that held the same exhausted determination she saw in her own reflection. She cleaned his wound with melted snow and a t-shirt she tore into strips, and he let her, too tired to resist. She fed him the last of her bread and a handful of jerky, and he ate slowly, deliberately, like he'd learned not to trust that food would come again. They sat together by the stove as the day crawled past, the fire eating through log after log, and she talked to him in a low voice about nothing, about the coast, about the group home, about the fact that she didn't know what happened next. He listened, or seemed to, and when night came, he curled against her legs and she felt the warmth of him through her jeans and thought that maybe she wasn't entirely alone after all. By the 3rd day, the snow had stopped, but the cold hadn't. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture in her breath froze against the window glass in fern patterns, and the firewood stack shrank faster than she wanted to think about. She knew she needed to do more than huddle by the stove. She needed food, needed to understand the space around her, needed to figure out if there was any chance of staying here longer than a few more days. The dog was stronger now, moving stiffly but moving, and when she pulled on her coat and boots and opened the door, he followed her out into the glittering silence. The clearing around the cabin was small, ringed by pines so thick with snow their branches bowed almost to the ground. The barn stood 30 yards away, a leaning structure with a roof that sagged in the middle and walls the color of weathered bone. Celia had noticed it that first night, a dark shape against the trees, but she'd been too cold and too scared to investigate. Now, with the dog limping at her side, she crossed the clearing and stood before the barn's wide double doors. One hung crooked on its hinges, the other was stuck fast, frozen into the frame. She gripped the edge of the crooked door and pulled, and it scraped open with a sound like a scream. Inside, the barn was dim and cavernous, lit only by the cracks in the walls where daylight leaked through in thin blades. The air smelled like hay and rust, and something sharper, chemical. Celia stepped carefully over the threshold, the dog pressing close to her leg. There were stalls along one side, empty except for drifts of ancient straw. A workbench ran the length of the opposite wall, cluttered with tools so old their handles had gone grey. The floor was dirt, frozen solid, and in the center of the space, a ladder led up to a hayloft thick with shadow. She didn't know what she was looking for. Food, maybe, or something she could burn, or some sign that people had lived here recently enough to leave something useful behind. She found it in the corner, behind a stack of rotting feed sacks. A wooden chest, low and wide, with iron corners and a hasp that wasn't locked. She crouched beside it, the dog sniffing at the edges, and lifted the lid. The hinges shrieked. Inside, carefully arranged, was a collection of objects that didn't make sense at first. Glass jars filled with seeds, their labels written in faded ink. A bundle of candles wrapped in waxed paper. A folding knife with a bone handle. A leather satchel stuffed with papers. 3 brown glass bottles with handwritten tags, a coil of wire, a small hatchet. A wool blanket, moth-eaten but intact. She lifted the satchel and opened it. And inside were notebooks, 5 of them, their covers stiff with age. She opened the first one and saw handwriting, small and precise, filling every page. The date on the first entry was from 40 years ago. The words were instructions. Celia sat on the frozen ground and read. The dog settled beside her, his chin on her knee. The notebooks were a manual, written by someone who had lived here, alone, through seasons that tried to kill them. There were diagrams for setting snares, for identifying edible plants under snow, for smoking meat and rendering fat, and keeping a fire low and steady to conserve wood. There were notes on the barn itself, where the best boards were hidden, where a second cache of supplies was buried under the floor of the third stall, how to patch the roof in spring. There were weather patterns tracked across years, warnings about when the pass would close and when the thaw would come. And there were stories, brief and matter-of-fact, about loneliness and purpose, and the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. She read until her fingers were too cold to turn the pages, and then she gathered the chest's contents into the wool blanket and carried everything back to the cabin. The dog followed, stepping carefully through the snow, and when they were inside again and the stove was fed and the door bolted against the wind, she spread the notebooks across the table and read by firelight. The seeds were labeled: turnips, kale, carrots, beets, cold weather crops. The bottles were tinctures, medicinal, labeled for infection and fever and pain. The papers in the satchel included a hand-drawn map of the property, marking a spring a quarter-mile east, a root cellar hidden under a stone slab near the cabins, north wall, and a stand of pine-marked resin fire starter salve. There was also a letter, addressed to no one, dated 2 winters before the final notebook entry. It read, "If you found this, you're in trouble. Use what's here. Stay smart. Stay warm. The mountain doesn't care, but you should." Celia felt something crack open inside her chest, something she didn't have a name for. Whoever had written these words was gone, but they'd left a gift for someone they'd never meet, and that someone was her. She thought about the group home, about the caseworkers who shuffled her between placements like paperwork, about the loneliness that felt like a physical weight. She thought about the dog, who had come to her out of the storm for no reason, except that he needed what she needed. And she thought about the barn and the chest, and the fact that survival wasn't just about lasting until spring, it was about deciding that lasting mattered. The next days were different. She used the map to find the root cellar, brushing away snow and prying up the stone slab to reveal a narrow space lined with shelves. Inside were jars of preserves, their seals intact: cherries, tomatoes, pickled beans. There were sacks of dried beans and rice untouched by mice, and a tin of lard gone solid with cold. She carried it all back to the cabin in trips, the dog trotting beside her, alert now, his ears swiveling at every sound. She cooked her first real meal in a week, rice with reconstituted tomatoes, a spoonful of lard for fat, and ate until her stomach ached, and gave the dog a portion that made his tail twitch. She read the notebooks cover to cover, then read them again. She learned how to set snares using wire and bait, how to check them without leaving scent, how to skin and clean a rabbit. She followed the instructions to find the spring, a dark pool half frozen, and chipped through the ice to fill the pot with water that didn't taste like metal. She gathered pine resin from the marked trees, her fingers sticky with sap, and mixed it with fat to make a salve she rubbed into the dog's healing wound. She practiced splitting wood the way the notebook described, letting the weight of the hatchet do the work, and her hands blistered and then hardened. The dog became her partner. He learned to stay close when she walked the snare lines, learned to bark once sharply, when he scented something she couldn't see. He caught a grouse on the edge of the clearing one morning, breaking its neck with a quick shake, and brought it to her with a pride that made her throat tight. She plucked it and roasted it over the stove, and they ate together, grease on their fingers and chins, and she told him he was good, the best, and he thumped his tail against the floor, but the cold deepened. The blizzard that had buried the cabin returned in a second wave, meaner than the first, and the wind drove snow through cracks she hadn't known existed. The firewood shrank again. The sky stayed white for days. She found herself rationing the preserves, counting jars, calculating how long she could make them last. The dog began to slow, his breath wheezing, and she noticed that the gash on his ribs, which had seemed to be healing, was hot to the touch and leaking fluid. She cleaned it with boiled water and applied the salve, but by the next morning he wouldn't eat and his eyes were dull. Panic came sharp and sudden. She couldn't lose him. He was the only thing that made this bearable, the only thing that felt like family. She pulled the notebooks out again, flipping through pages with shaking hands, looking for anything about infection, about sickness. She found a note scrawled in the margin of the third notebook. Dog bite festered. Use the brown bottle, 2 drops in water, twice a day. Poulticed with resin salve. Fever broke on the 3rd day. She ran to the chest, grabbed the brown bottles, read the labels. One said, infection internal. She measured 2 drops into a cup of water, her hands unsteady, and coaxed the dog to drink. He lapped it weakly, then laid his head down. She sat beside him, her hand on his side, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. The fever climbed through the night. She kept the fire high, kept the salve fresh on his wound, kept talking to him in a voice that cracked. She told him he had to stay, that she needed him, that they were supposed to do this together. She told him about the coast, about the plan she'd had, about how stupid it seemed now. She told him she was sorry she didn't have a name for him, and then she gave him one, ash for the color of his fur in firelight. He didn't respond, just breathed in shallow hitches, and she lay down beside him on the floor and matched her breathing to his. On the 2nd day, his fever spiked so high, she could feel the heat radiating off him. She dosed him again, double-checked the notebook's instructions, applied a fresh poultice. She boiled water and soaked rags and laid them across his body to bring the temperature down. She prayed even though she didn't know who she was praying to, and she bargained, promising to be better, to be smarter, to never run away again if he would just stay. The storm screamed outside. The cabin creaked. Ash's breathing went ragged, then shallow, then so faint she had to press her ear to his ribs to hear it. And then near dawn on the 3rd day, he sighed, a long, deep exhale, and his eyes opened. He looked at her and his tail moved just once. The fever had broken, Celia cried. She didn't mean to, didn't want to, but the relief was so enormous it had nowhere else to go. She held Ash carefully, her face buried in his fur, and he tolerated it with the patience of someone who understood. She gave him water, then a little broth made from the last of the rabbit, and he drank and ate and slept, and this time his sleep was easy. She sat by the stove and read the letter again. The mountain doesn't care, but you should. She thought about the person who had lived here, who had written those words, who had left behind everything she needed to survive, not just the physical things, but the knowledge, the proof that it was possible. She thought about the choice she'd made to run, and the choice she was making now to stay at least until spring, at least until she could figure out what came next. She wasn't alone. She had Ash, she had the cabin, she had the barn and the notebooks and the seeds waiting for Thor. The rest of the winter was hard, but it was different. She ran the snare line every morning, Ash limping beside her, his strength returning slowly. She caught rabbits, a squirrel, once a fox she felt guilty about, but cleaned and used anyway. She learned to read the weather by the color of the sky, to measure firewood by the week, to make a single jar of preserves last 3 days. She found the second cache under the barn floor. More candles, a whetstone, a sewing kit, a tin of salt, and she thanked the stranger who'd left it out loud, her voice echoing in the cold space. She patched the cabin's worst cracks with moss and mud, and when the wind blew, it didn't cut through as sharp. She wrote in the margins of the notebooks, adding her own observations. Ash caught a grouse near the big pine. Good hunting there. Snow drifts deepest on the east side. Check snares on the west first. Turnip seeds. Plant these near the spring when ground thaws. She didn't know if anyone would ever read them, but it mattered to write them down, to add her voice to the strangers, to leave proof that she'd been here and survived. The days lengthened. The snow began to soften at the edges, and she heard the distant crack of ice breaking on the spring. Ash's wound healed to a scar, and his ribs filled out, and he started to play, pouncing on shadows, nosing her hand for attention. She started to think about spring, about planting the seeds, about whether she could stay here longer, whether this place could be more than a shelter. She didn't know what the law would say, didn't know if anyone owned this land or cared, but she knew she was alive and Ash was alive, and the barn had saved them both. One morning she woke to sunlight, real sunlight, golden warm through the window, and the sound of water dripping from the eaves. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside, Ash bounding ahead, and the clearing was transformed. The snow had pulled back to reveal dark earth, and the pines were tipped with green, and the air smelled like thaw. She walked to the barn, Ash sniffing at everything, and stood in the doorway looking at the chest still open, the notebooks stacked beside it. She thought about the life the stranger had lived here, alone, deliberate. She thought about the life she might live, if she was brave enough. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how she'd explain this to the authorities, or if they'd let her stay, or what happened when the summer came and the hikers returned and someone asked questions. But she knew she wasn't the same girl who'd stumbled onto this ridge 5 months ago, desperate and directionless. She'd learned to survive. She'd learned to care for something other than herself. She'd learned that loneliness and solitude weren't the same thing, and that a life could be built from scraps and willpower and the kindness of strangers who'd never know your name. She went back to the cabin and made a plan. She'd plant the seeds. She'd repair the barn roof. She'd hike down to the valley when the pass cleared, not to disappear, but to find out what her options were, whether there was a way to stay, whether the state would listen, whether she could make a case for this place as home. And if they said no, she'd figure something else out. She wasn't running anymore. She was building. Ash stayed close always. They worked together through the spring, turning the soil near the cabin, planting rows of turnips and kale and carrots. She used the notebooks as a guide, and when the first green shoots appeared, she felt a satisfaction so deep it didn't need words. She fixed the barn roof with boards from the cache, and nails she straightened with the hatchet. She walked the ridge, mapping it in her mind, learning the shape of the land. She saw deer, once a black bear lumbering through the trees, and she felt like she belonged to this place in a way she'd never belonged anywhere. In late spring, she made the hike down to the valley. It took 2 days, Ash beside her the whole way, and when she reached the ranger station, she told them the truth about the cabin, about the winter, about what she'd found in the barn. The ranger was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a skeptical expression, and she made some calls and took some notes and said she'd look into it. Celia didn't expect much, but a week later, back at the cabin, the ranger hiked up with papers and a proposition. The land was part of a conservation easement, abandoned by the previous owner decades ago. The state had no use for the cabin. If Celia was willing to finish school remotely, check in monthly and maintain the property, they'd consider a custodial arrangement until she turned 18. After that, they'd reassess. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was a chance. Celia signed the papers on the cabin's table, Ash asleep by the stove, and she felt the weight of the winter lift just enough to let her breathe. She thought about the stranger who'd lived here before her, who'd left the chest and the notebooks and the letter. She thought about the choice they'd made to stay, and the choice she was making now. She wasn't lost anymore. She was found. The summer came, warm and green. The garden grew. She canned the surplus, following instructions from the notebooks, and lined the jars on the shelves in the root cellar. She cut firewood and stacked it against the cabin wall, preparing for the next winter. She read at night by candlelight, and sometimes she added to the notebooks her handwriting next to the stranger's, a conversation across time. Ash grew strong and sleek, and he hunted and played and slept with his head on her feet, and she thought that maybe love was just this, showing up every day. For the things that mattered, she didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she'd stay here forever, or if this was just a chapter, or if the state would change its mind. But she knew that the barn had saved them. The chest, the notebooks, the seeds, the medicine, it had all been there waiting, left by someone who understood that survival was both practical and emotional, that you needed food and fire but also purpose and proof that you weren't the first to fight this fight. She'd been lost and she'd been found, and the finding had come from the hands of a stranger who'd believed that kindness could outlast a lifetime. On the longest day of the year, she stood in the clearing at dusk and watched the light fade over the ridge. Ash sat beside her, his fur warm against her leg. The cabin glowed behind them, firelight in the window. The barn stood silent and strong. The garden rustled in the breeze. She thought about the girl she'd been, running blind through the snow, and the girl she was now, rooted and deliberate. She thought about the fact that home wasn't something you were given. It was something you built, piece by piece, with your hands and your heart and the help of those who came before. She didn't say it out loud, but she thought it clearly, sending it out into the twilight like a prayer. Thank you. For the chest, for the notebooks, for believing someone would come. For saving us. The mountain didn't answer. It never did. But the stars came out cold and bright, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and Celia knew bone deep that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. If this story moved you, hit like now, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Comment below and tell me, what hidden resource or strength did you discover in your hardest season? Share this with someone who needs hope today.